My daughter sent me a text. Just 5 words. We're cutting ties right now. I stood there in the kitchen, holding the same old wooden spoon I used to feed her mashed carrots with when she was a toddler. She didn't call. She didn't explain. That night, I turned my phone off. By morning, it lit up with 77 missed calls. But by then, I had already let go. What came next, even she couldn't undo. It was early, just after sunrise. I was flipping the last batch of cornbread over in a cast iron skillet. The pond still held the smoky scent from the hickory wood we burned the night before. The walls around me felt heavy with memory. Alma's laughter still seemed to echo in the beams above. Mud-crusted boots still sat by the door from one of those long hikes. I could almost see little Melanie again, her fingers reaching for hot biscuits, curls damp from mountain air. That morning was too still, the kind of stillness that comes right before everything breaks. I didn't hear her car pull in, but I noticed the shimmer of brand new tires just past the screen door. Melanie had shown up 2 days earlier. No warning, she stepped out of the car with a suitcase in one hand and a laptop in the other. She kissed my cheek and said she'd be home for a while. And I believed her. She told me she wanted to reimagine the place. I thought she meant a fresh coat of paint, maybe new shutters. That first evening, her eyes lit up while she spoke about branding and potential. She talked fast like she was pitching at a conference, not talking to her mama. She used words I didn't recognize. Conversion funnels, scalable growth, heritage packaging. I really tried to keep up, but all I remember is the smell of burnt butter because I had left the skillet on the heat too long. She told me people were drawn to authenticity and said we had if we could just package it right. I looked around that kitchen. Nothing here needed packaging. The floor still groaned the same way it had for 40 years. The curtains still carried the smell of sage and wood smoke. When she came down that morning, she didn't even glance at the food on the table. She just held up her phone. A photographer was on the way. She said she needed shots for the story. I asked her if she wanted me to wear the apron Elma had stitched my name onto back in 1983. She smiled like I'd said something quaint. Then she laughed not unkindly, just far away. They showed up in a car worth more than my whole house. Someone politely asked me to step aside, said the lighting was better near the window. So I moved back toward the stove and stirred the beans. When the shutter clicked, I heard them say the name. Maple & Co. No one asked who had made the beans. If you've ever been in a room where you once mattered and suddenly didn't, you'll understand. I didn't yell that day, but something inside me quietly broke loose. If you've ever poured your soul into something, only to watch it get rewrapped in someone else's ribbon, you'll know the feeling. And that, my dear, is when this story really began. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, like I always had. The mountain air slipped through the windows, sharp and piney, leaving little fog rings on the glass. I tied my hair back and reached for the same blue cardigan I'd worn for years. The sleeves had worn soft at the elbows, thinned with time, but it was mine. Downstairs, I could hear Melanie already on a call, her voice clipped and businesslike. She had taken over Elma's old office. That room had been untouched for nearly a decade. She had asked if she could work in there just for a while. I said yes before thinking it through. Now the door stayed shut. I made breakfast like I always did. Ground the coffee beans by hand, cracked eggs into the pan, sliced tomatoes fresh off the vines by the porch. I wasn't looking for thanks, but once upon a time, It had meant something. When she finally came out, her heels tapped sharp across the floor like they didn't belong here. She wore tailored slacks and a silk blouse, her hair pulled so tight it looked like it might ache. She glanced at the food I'd laid out. I pulled out a chair for her. She said she had an early video call and grabbed a banana instead. I swallowed my words and sat down alone. That afternoon, 2 young men came with gear in the back of a van. They brought lighting equipment and rearranged the living room like it was a movie set. They moved the rocking chair into the corner without asking. A woman with a clipboard walked through the kitchen like she was inspecting a property for resale. Melanie trailed behind them, giving directions with her hands like she was on a soundstage. She had taken down the photos in the hallway. The one of my parents on their wedding day was gone. In its place were sleek black and white mountain prints with no faces, no names. The shelf that once held mason jars and our family cookbooks now displayed beige ceramic bowls and lavender sprigs. She called it staging. She said the camera loved neutrality. That evening, she showed me designs on her laptop. A clean, polished logo, Maple & Co., simple lines, gold lettering, the kind you might see on the door of a high-end bank. She'd already bought the domain, built a newsletter. I asked her where my name would go. She said the brand was bigger than either of us now. She didn't say it with cruelty, just finality. I didn't argue. I nodded and got up to boil water for tea. Later that night, I passed the office again. The light was still on. She was typing fast, the screen lighting up her face. She looked so focused, so sure of herself, but something stopped me. A photo of her and Elma had been moved into a drawer. It was the one they took on their last hike before his diagnosis. Elma had his arm wrapped around her shoulder. They were both squinting into the sun. That photo was folded in half. I closed the drawer without a sound. The next day, a stack of boxes arrived. Inside were branded napkins, printed menus, and tiny product tags for merchandise that didn't exist yet. Even the tasting spoons were fancy bamboo, with Maple & Co. etched right at the tip. The photographer came back. This time, she brought a stylist. They asked if I had any plain clothing, something without patterns. I brought out my Sunday dress, the one Elma used to say made me look like spring. The stylist smiled politely and placed it back on the hanger. Then she handed me a beige apron. Melanie said it was more on brand, so I wore it. They had me stand by the stove, holding a pot of beans I didn't even make. They told me to smile softly, like I was remembering something sweet. I smiled, but my chest ached. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold too quickly. The old signs Elma carved years ago still leaned against the siding. One had a deep crack running straight down the middle, just like everything else lately. I told myself it was just a phase. That maybe this was Melanie's way of finding her footing. That maybe letting go was just part of getting older. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a remodel. It was a quiet erasure. The next afternoon, I stood near the kitchen doorway, drying my hands on a faded dish towel. Melanie's team had taken over the dining table. They cleared everything off: placemats, candles, even the table runner Elma's mother crocheted with arthritic hands decades ago. Now the table held a laptop, glossy pamphlets, and a tray of store-bought pastries. Melanie clicked through slides on her screen, voice steady and sweet, like she was presenting to strangers. I hadn't been invited to the meeting, wasn't even told it was happening, but I could hear every word. She talked about storytelling, legacy, and rural luxury. She called the house a backdrop. She referred to me as a visual element. She called my food rustic charm. Someone asked where the recipes came from. She chuckled and said they were inspired by local memory. She didn't mention the binder in my drawer, the one full of handwritten notes, my handwriting, Alma's scribbles in the margins. They passed around a brochure mock-up. I saw the cover. Maple & Co., a taste of timeless comfort. There was a smiling woman on the front, gray hair, holding a pie, but it wasn't me. They used a stock photo. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the porch screen, and the tree limbs creak like old bones. There was a tenderness in me that felt bruised, like a pulled muscle I didn't know I had until I tried to move. At 3 a.m., I slipped out of bed and walked into the kitchen. I turned on the little lamp Elma installed years ago. Opened the drawer. The binder was still there. Its pages were worn at the edges, some yellowed with age, others stained with cinnamon or warped by steam. Each recipe told a story, not just ingredients, but notes about who loved it, when we made it, what it meant. I ran my fingers over the apple butter cake page. Alma had written too much nutmeg and underlined it twice. I'd never agreed, but I never changed it either. The next morning, I sat at the table, watching Melanie walk in with her eyes glued to her phone. I asked her to sit for just a minute. She looked up briefly, said she was running late, and headed for the door. I told her I wanted to talk about the name, about how things were being framed. She paused, just a second. Then she said gently that everything evolves, that the personal touches were still there, just reinterpreted. She told me to trust the process. Said I was overthinking it. She smiled, kissed the top of my head, and left. I sat there long after the door closed behind her. That afternoon, I wandered the property, past the shed, down by the creek where she once fell in chasing frogs. The air was thick with late summer heat, cicadas buzzing loud and steady. That's when I saw it. The sign on the road was gone. The one that read "Any Shelter," carved by hand into cedar by Elma himself. In its place, leaning against the fence, was a sleek wooden plank. Blank. No one asked. No one told me. Later that day, I opened the website Melanie had registered. I wasn't tech-savvy, but I knew enough to find the About page. It mentioned tradition. It mentioned mountain upbringing. It even mentioned family inspiration. But not once did it say my name. I searched every section, every photo, every page. The kitchen I had cooked in for 40 years was there, but only as a backdrop. My face wasn't. My voice wasn't. I closed the laptop slowly, let my hand rest on the lid longer than necessary. That evening, I didn't cook, didn't light the stove. I opened a can of soup and sat at the far end of the porch. Watched the last bit of daylight stretch thin across the trees. Melanie didn't come home until after dark. She brought a guest with her, woman in heels, carrying a camera, stepping carefully across the gravel. They whispered to each other, laughed once, then Melanie pointed toward the back garden. My garden, the one Elma and I built from scratch. The one I still tended every season. They took pictures. Melanie posed beside the tomato vines, reached for a sunflower, tilted her chin toward the light. The woman snapped dozens of photos, none with me in them, and that's when I knew this wasn't just rebranding. It wasn't just style. I was being erased, not all at once, but bit by bit, quietly, neatly, like I'd never been there at all. 2 mornings later, the sun had barely crested the ridge when I stepped outside with my coffee. The porch was still, but not the comforting kind. It was the sort of quiet that doesn't know where to settle. I walked down the gravel path to the mailbox, my slippers soaked through from the morning dew. Inside was a thick envelope addressed to Maple & Co. The name felt foreign in my hands, not because I didn't recognize it, but because I did. And I knew it no longer included me. Inside were the registration papers. Melanie had officially filed to turn the property into a commercial venue. I scanned the fine print. The words were polished, but the message was plain. Every square inch of this land was now listed under a limited liability corporation. Her name was the only one on the forms. The house where I'd lived for 42 years. The land Elma had cleared by hand. The creek where Melanie used to float twigs and call them ships. All of it now legally hers. I went back inside and laid the envelope on the counter. I didn't move for a long time, just stood there, letting my fingertips brush the paper like maybe the words would change. Later that afternoon, Melanie came bursting in, her voice bright and fast, tumbling over itself. She said investors were interested, that a regional blog had featured our Appalachian experience, that they were talking about pop-up shops and branded jams. She didn't even see the envelope. I asked her if she planned to stay long-term. She smiled and said she was rooting here for a while. I don't think she realized how that sounded. That night I couldn't eat. The air inside the house felt too tight. I opened the windows. It didn't help. So I walked out to the shed. Elma's fishing rod still hung from the same old nail. His tools were lined up neatly on the workbench untouched. I sat down on the stool and closed my eyes. I remembered the day he built the back porch, how we measured every beam twice because we couldn't afford mistakes or contractors. How he whistled the whole time, how little Melanie painted sunflowers on the railing. Her hands stained yellow for a week. That version of her still lived in me, still held on. The next morning, I made a decision. I didn't tell anyone, just started quietly collecting documents. Property titles, tax receipts, a copy of the original deed. I tucked them into a folder and slid it beneath my mattress, not out of fear, but out of clarity. That evening, Melanie handed me a menu draft to review. Avocado toast, lavender tea, vegan chili. I asked her about the apple butter cake. She said it felt too old-fashioned for the image they were trying to create. That word old-fashioned landed harder than I expected. She patted my hand and told me not to take things personally. I smiled. I nodded. The next day, 2 representatives from a regional food company arrived for a house tour. One wore brand new boots that had never seen mud. The other carried a tablet, pointing at corners, talking about natural light and marketable angles. They were polite, charming even, but they never asked for me. They asked for Melanie. I stayed in the pantry until they left. Not hiding, just choosing where I belonged. That night, I baked the apple butter cake anyway. The smell drifted through the house-warm spices, slow-baked apples, cinnamon hanging in the air like memory. I placed it on the counter with 2 forks. An invitation, not a confrontation. Melanie came in an hour later. She saw the cake and smiled like it was a relic. She took a bite, said it was good, said it reminded her of something though she couldn't quite say what. Then she walked away. And that's when something in me shifted. It wasn't rage, it wasn't grief. It was a quiet, steady line being drawn. I washed the forks, wiped the counter clean, then stepped out onto the porch. The wind had picked up. Clouds were gathering above the ridge. I sat down slowly and let the dark settle in. The next morning, I made my bed, folded the laundry, and called a woman named Lois who lived 2 counties over. She used to run a legal clinic out of a church basement. We hadn't spoken in years, but when she answered, it was like no time had passed. I told her I had a few questions about land use, inheritance rights, and transfer protections. She didn't ask why. She just said, "Let's begin." I hung up and made tea. Melanie was in the kitchen, pacing through another call. She was talking about funding, licensing, opening a second location. I poured the tea and stepped out onto the porch. My hands were steady. My breath was calm. I knew what I had to do, not out of spite, but because someone had to remember what mattered. And I wasn't going to ask for permission. The next morning, I woke before the birds. The house was still, but not in the peaceful way I used to know. It felt hollow, like an empty jar after the preserves are gone. I made 1 cup of coffee, no toast, no eggs. Just the bitter kind of strength you drink when everything else feels outside your control. I pulled the manila folder out from under the mattress and took it to the guest room window. I spread everything out on the quilted bedspread: old deeds, tax records, notarized copies. And one thing I hadn't touched in years, a letter Elma had written by hand just weeks before he passed. He wasn't a man of many words. But near the bottom, in firm, careful script, he'd written one line that stopped me cold. "This place belongs to Evelyn until her last breath." I clutched that page like a lifeline. That day, Melanie was out visiting partners. She used that word now, not neighbors, not friends, partners. It gave me time. I called Lois again and asked if she could meet me in person. We chose the Cedar Hill Library tucked into the genealogy section, out of sight. She was just as sharp as ever. She flipped through the paperwork with her lips pressed together and her brow low. Then she gave me 3 options. The third one caught my breath. I could legally transfer the house and garden the original homestead into a protected trust. Separate from the LLC Melanie had filed. It wouldn't undo what was done, but it would set a line no one could cross without me. It wouldn't be loud or dramatic, but it would be real, and it would mean something. We filed the paperwork that same afternoon. A few signatures, a notary stamp, less than 40 minutes to do what I should have done a decade ago. When I came home, Melanie was entertaining 2 couples on the back porch. "They're from Asheville," she said, "big on experience-based dining." They were sipping chilled herbal tea from mason jars I used to fill with peach preserves. I watched from the kitchen window as Melanie gestured toward the hills like they were hers to offer. Later, she came in flushed and excited. She said a regional distributor was interested. She asked if I'd consider baking some of the old recipes, again not for sale, just for display. She said it would add credibility. I nodded, then asked if she could help me bring in the laundry from the line. She blinked, said she had a call in 10, and disappeared up the stairs. I walked out alone and pulled the sun-dried sheets down one by one. The air smelled like honeysuckle and dust. Somewhere across the ridge, I could hear a slow-moving tractor. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my journal. I hadn't written in weeks, but that night, the words came fast. I wrote about silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that replaces you. The kind that dulls your voice until even you forget what it used to sound like. I wrote about Elma's hands, how they spoke the language of this land better than any tongue could. How he carved every fence post with care, never speed. I wrote about Melanie's laugh when she was 5, how it sounded like wind chimes in spring, and I wrote about the line I had drawn. Not for battle, but for memory. The next day, I cooked for myself. Real food, pinto beans with ham, skillet cornbread, stewed okra. I ate on the back steps with the sun warming my knees. No cameras, no audience, just me. Melanie rushed past on her way to another meeting. She didn't see the food. That night, the porch light went out. I didn't replace it. Instead, I lit a single candle in the kitchen window. As I walked past the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of myself. Not tired, not bitter, still here. Still the woman who knew which floorboard creaked just before the back door. Still the one who remembered which herbs thrived on the west side of the shed. Still Evelyn, and for the first time in weeks, I felt rooted again. Not victorious, not triumphant, just still. Like the foundation beneath this house, quiet and too deep to move. The phone buzzed just after 7 a.m. I was out at the hen house, pouring feed into the trough, when I heard it echo from the kitchen window. By the time I got to it, there were 6 missed calls, all from Melanie. She hadn't called me that often since the week her father passed. I didn't call back, not yet. Instead, I walked to the garden. The marigolds were drooping at the base, and the basil needed trimming. I worked in silence, letting the soil ground me while the noise settled elsewhere. A little sparrow landed on the fence post, same one I'd seen 3 mornings in a row. Still alone, inside, Melanie had left a note on the counter. Running late. Can we talk tonight? I folded the paper and tucked it in the drawer with the matches and the prayer cards. I wasn't ready to talk, at least not on her schedule. That evening, she came home earlier than usual. No phone in her hand, no breathless updates, just a quiet stiffness in her shoulders, like something was weighing her down. She stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure, like a guest wondering if she still belonged. Then she asked if we could sit. I nodded and pulled out the chair across from mine. She told me the blog post had gone viral. People were asking to visit, to book stays, to order kits. Then she paused and said something I didn't expect. A producer from a national show had reached out. They wanted to do a segment on our mother-daughter legacy. She smiled like that news might melt me, but her eyes didn't match the smile. She added they wanted me in the piece holding a rolling pin, maybe laughing in the kitchen, maybe even wearing the old apron. I asked her, why now? She didn't answer right away. Just looked down at her hands, twisting the hem of her sleeve. She said she was trying to build something lasting, that I should be proud. I told her the house was already lasting. That love didn't need rebranding. Her jaw tensed just a flicker, but I saw it. Then she asked why I had talked to Lois. I didn't ask how she knew. Melanie always had a way of knowing things. I told her the truth, that I had protected what I could. Not from her, but for myself. She asked if I thought she was the enemy. I told her I thought she had forgotten what home means. She stood then, said she needed some air. The door closed gently behind her. I stayed seated, hands folded, listening to the dark press in. There were no more words to rearrange. The next morning, she was gone before I woke, but a full pot of coffee waited on the counter. A quiet offering. The rest of the week passed in hush. She moved through the house like a visitor. Polite, efficient, distant, until Thursday. I was on the porch shelling peas into an enamel bowl when a man pulled into the driveway. He wore a blazer and a grin too wide to trust. Said he was a media consultant. Said he was here to discuss the shoot. Said he brought a team to scout lighting and props, though they'd prefer to use some authentic elements. He looked at me like I was one of them. I nodded and led him inside. Showed him the pantry, the spice rack, the sunny corner where I used to rock Melanie to sleep when she had colic. He took notes, snapped pictures with his phone, never once asking permission. Then he stopped in front of a framed photo near the stove. Me and Elma, our first summer here, hands dirty. Grins full of grit and hope. He paused, said maybe they could use it. Maybe crop it. I didn't say a word. I reached for the frame and turned it face down. He didn't understand. Just thanked me, said I'd be great on camera, and left. That night, Melanie sat beside me on the porch for the first time in weeks. No phones, no checklists. Just the two of us and the soft creak of the wood beneath our feet. She asked if I was angry. I told her no. I was just tired. She said she wanted to make things right. I said, then stopped turning me into a product. She went quiet. Long enough for the night sounds to fill the space between us. Then she said maybe it had gone too far, that she got swept up, that she only wanted people to see what I had built. I told her I didn't need people to see it. I just needed her to remember it. She didn't reply. But she didn't leave either. She stayed. And in that moment, that was more than I expected. By midnight, the house had gone still again. I stood by the kitchen window, looking out toward the pasture. Somewhere in the dark, a fox barked once, then silence. And in that silence, I realized this wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the first time I felt she actually heard me. Not as a brand, not as a symbol, but as her mother. And for now, that was enough to hold on to. The next morning, dew shimmered across the grass like glass dust. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, wrapping my shawl tighter around my shoulders. The air had changed, still warm, but edged with something softer. A shift not just in the season, but in the house. Melanie had been quieter since the night we sat together. She still took meetings, still answered calls. But her voice had softened. Her eyes looked tired in a different way, like something inside her had begun to loosen. By noon, she asked if I wanted to go with her to the general store in town. We hadn't gone anywhere together in months. I said yes. The drive was mostly silent. We passed stretches of land that had grown wilder since Elma left. The road curled through old maple groves and goldenrod fields. Everything touched with age and grace. When we pulled into the gravel lot, I noticed the slight hesitation before she turned off the engine. Inside, she chatted with the cashier, pointing to shelves of local jams and asking about label sources. I wandered toward the back, past the canning supplies, and into the corner lined with soaps and honey tins. There was a shelf of local goods, and on it, a photo from the 1950s. Two women in aprons, dusted with flour, standing in front of crates of preserves. Their smiles weren't posed. They were real. I stood there longer than I meant to. When we got back home, Melanie carried in the groceries and asked if I'd help her test a new version of the menu. She said she'd added the apple butter cake back in, called it Evelyn's hearth slice. I didn't answer right away. Just kept folding the tea towels, lining them up neat in the drawer. Then I said her name, not sharply, just firmly enough to still the room. I told her I wouldn't be a slice or a story. I said I could bake if I wanted to, but I would never be a concept. She blinked, didn't speak. Then she placed the menu draft on the counter and walked out. Later, I heard her on the phone. Her voice was tight, shaking slightly. I couldn't hear the words, just the sound of someone trying not to cry while still holding it together. That night I couldn't sleep, so I sat in the chair by the fireplace and opened Elma's old journal, the one he kept in pencil with smudges on every other page. Planting notes, seasonal rhythms, scattered thoughts. One entry stopped me cold. If it ever gets too shiny, it ain't real anymore. I ran my finger over that sentence and closed the book. The next morning, I found Melanie sitting on the back steps. No makeup, no phone, just her, watching the wind move through the trees. She asked me how I kept things steady all those years. I told her I didn't. I just showed up every morning and paid attention. She didn't say anything after that, but she stayed there a long time. 2 days later, the production crew arrived. Vans rolled in with cables, racks of curated authentic clothing, lighting rigs, and a checklist longer than the porch. One man wore headphones and barked timing cues. Another rearranged my curtains like they were props. I watched from the hallway as they replaced my cookbooks with vintage replicas, swapped my just snapped green beans with fake wooden ones. It wasn't real, and it had never been their story to tell. Melanie saw me watching from the hallway. I turned to leave, but she called out. She said she'd told them to stop filming. I didn't turn around. She followed me outside, her voice lower now. She said it didn't feel right. Said she stood in the kitchen and realized she didn't recognize it anymore. Not because of the cameras, but because I wasn't in it. She said she couldn't sell something she didn't understand. I looked at her, really looked, and I saw her again. Not the woman with the marketing decks and polished language, but my daughter, the girl who used to blow dandelion seeds into the wind and whisper her wishes. I told her if she truly wanted to understand, she'd have to let go first. Let go of the story she'd been trying to write, and of the version of herself that believed everything needed packaging. That night, she sent the crew home. No speech, no big decision meeting. Just quiet, final. The porch light stayed off. And for the first time in months, the house exhaled. The next morning, everything felt different. No camera tripods near the stairs. No spotlight gear cluttering the porch. Just the low hum of the fridge. The familiar creak of wood under bare feet. The soft rhythm of a home remembering how to breathe. I stood by the sink, washing 2 mugs, one for tea, one for coffee. Simple tasks that steadied the soul. The wind slipped through the cracked window above the sink. It felt lighter, like something had been lifted. Melanie came downstairs still in her robe. She moved slower. Like maybe the pace of the house had started to seep back into her bones. She didn't reach for her phone. Didn't open her laptop. She poured herself some coffee and sat at the kitchen table without a word. And we sat like that, 2 women in the same quiet. Not performing, just present. That afternoon, she came out to the garden. I was trimming back the mint where it had started creeping into the lettuce bed. She crouched down beside me, rolled up her sleeves, started thinning the chives without needing to ask how. We worked in silence, the kind of silence where hands know more than mouths ever will. Eventually, she told me she'd called off the expansion plans. Said she refunded the deposits, closed the blog accounts. The sponsors weren't happy, she said. There would be fees, penalties. She'd take the loss. But she said she was done pretending. I didn't answer. Just handed her the garden scissors when she reached for them. That night, we cooked together, not for pictures, not for launch, just for us. We used her grandmother's old cast iron skillet, the one with the chipped handle that somehow still balanced perfectly. Fried green tomatoes, cornbread warming in the oven, a pot of Crowder peas simmering slow on the stove, the kind of meal that pulls memory out of the walls. We ate by candlelight on the back porch. The stars came out one by one. No music, no clicking shutters, just cicadas and the soft groan of the screen door. The next morning, she asked if we could drive up to the north pasture. We hadn't been out that far since the winter before Elma passed. The gravel road was rough, but the truck still made it. The sky opened wide above us, clouds drifting slow over blue. She pointed to the old hunting cabin near the tree line. Said maybe it was time to let the land rest. No tents, no tour, no brand, just land. Let it be what it was meant to be. She looked at me then and waited. I told her I'd been letting it rest all along. She smiled. We stayed until the sun dipped low and bathed everything in gold. Later that week, we sat at the dining room table, Elma's table, the one he built with his own hands. We spread out the papers together. The trust I'd created, the original deed, the legal boundaries that split her LLC from the land I had reclaimed. She asked if we could revise it. Not to erase the line, but to make it clearer. She said she didn't want to take anything anymore. She wanted to earn it. It was the first time in months I saw something honest in her eyes. Not ambition, not a plan, just regret and hope. We spent 3 evenings going over every page. I called Lois, and she agreed to help draft a joint agreement, one that protected both of us, one that left room for something real, not business, family. On the last day, Melanie asked if she could add something to the plan. She wanted to set aside part of the land near the big willow tree. Said she wanted it to be a memorial garden, a place for native flowers. And Elma's old bench. No signs, no branding. Just space to breathe. I said yes. When the papers were signed, she didn't cheer. She folded them slowly, placed them in the drawer beside my prayer cards. That night, we walked the edge of the property. No talking. Just the sound of our steps and the moon high above. The creek whispered beside us, same voice it had always had. I looked over at her and saw something I hadn't noticed before. She'd stopped trying to be the next big thing and started remembering what it meant to belong. Back inside, she made chamomile tea and left a cup on the windowsill for me, just like I used to do for her when she was in college, too homesick to admit it. I watched her climb the stairs, quiet and unhurried. Then I sat with my tea, the steam curling into the hush of the house. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. The next week came with a breeze cooler than the last. Early signs of fall whispered through the trees. The garden beds had been cleared. The firewood stacked neatly against the shed. Each morning, frost painted the window panes in delicate lace. Melanie stayed through it all. She didn't ask for anything. She just showed up. Sometimes she was up before me, already making coffee. Other mornings, I'd find her walking the fence line in Elma's old boots, her hands buried in her coat pockets. There was no schedule, no project plan, just presence. One Sunday, we sat side by side in the old church pew, third row from the back, the same seat Elma and I had shared for nearly 40 years. The choir sang slower these days. The heater ticked and rattled with age, but the room still held. That morning, Pastor Ray preached on forgiveness, not as a single act, but as space you make within yourself, a clearing not for the one who hurt you but for your own peace to breathe again. Melanie didn't look at me during the sermon, but her hand trembled just slightly when she placed the hymnal back in the rack. That night, she came into my room, sat on the edge of the bed without saying a word. She looked down at the quilt, tracing the stitching like it might speak first. Then she told me she'd written something. Not a post, not a pitch, a letter to Elma. She said it was something she should have done a long time ago. She asked if I'd read it when I was ready. I waited until morning, made myself a cup of tea, sat by the fire, opened the envelope she'd left on the kitchen table. The letter wasn't polished. It wasn't edited for tone or clarity. It was raw. She wrote about how she had misunderstood what strength looked like, how she had chased recognition, thinking it would secure legacy. She wrote about skipping Elma's birthday to close a funding deal, and how she told herself it was for our future. She wrote about the space she had put between us, not out of hate, but out of pride, and she ended with one sentence I'll never forget. If I ever rebuild anything worth leaving behind, it will be because I finally sat still long enough to learn what you were trying to teach me. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the cedar box where I still keep all of Elma's notes to me, tied with ribbon, soft at the corners. Later that day, we walked out to the clearing behind the pasture. The memorial bench had finally been placed under the willow tree. Melanie carried a mason jar full of wildflowers. I brought the small bronze plaque we had ordered weeks ago. It read simply, "For the hands that built this." We set the jar beside the bench. The flowers trembled gently in the wind. Melanie knelt down and brushed away some dirt from the base. Then she pressed her palm to the wood, like she was anchoring herself to it. She didn't cry, not loudly, but her shoulders curled inward. Her breath caught, and that was enough. As we walked back toward the house, she asked if we could start writing things down. Stories mine, Elma's, the family's. Not for publishing, not for the brand, just to keep. She said she wanted the truth, on paper, unpolished, unbranded. I told her we could begin tomorrow. That night, after she went to bed, I sat at the dining room table and opened our oldest photo album. There was one picture I lingered on. Melanie at age 8, knees scraped, arms full of wildflowers, smiling at me from the front step like joy lived behind her teeth. The light in her eyes hadn't vanished. It had just gone quiet. The house felt different now. Not perfect, not healed, but honest. And for the first time in years, something shifted in me too. Not just relief, not just peace, but readiness for whatever came next. The first snow came quietly, blanketing the fields in soft white just before dawn. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the flakes move sideways across the barn roof. The world outside held its breath. Inside, Melanie moved slower now, not out of caution, but care. She no longer rushed through rooms like she had somewhere more important to be. She had grown into the quiet. That morning, we started organizing the notebooks we'd begun together. Each one held fragments of our life, recipes, planting logs, journal entries, Elma's letters, things we didn't want to lose. They weren't arranged by theme or date, just stacked like stones holding shape by meaning, not order. Melanie brought in an old wooden cabinet from the shed. We wiped it clean together, slid the notebooks inside, along with the digitized ledgers she had printed and bound. We didn't speak, but I noticed the small brass label she had fastened to the cabinet door. It read, "Kept." Later that week, I went out to the garden with my old spade, the one with the worn handle, and the initials Elma burned into the wood. It wasn't planting season, not in December, but I wanted to turn the soil, feel the weight of it in my hands. Melanie followed me out with 2 mugs of tea and a blanket around her shoulders. She didn't interrupt. She just sat on the bench and watched. I dug 1 row, then paused. My knees aren't what they used to be, and the cold stung my fingers, but the motion felt familiar, true. She asked if she could finish the row. I handed her the spade. She pressed it into the dirt like Elma taught her years ago. Not perfect, but steady. When she reached the end, she leaned on the handle and looked up at me. Her cheek was streaked with dirt. Wine tangled through her hair. And I saw it, clear as day. She belonged again. That evening, as we prepared dinner, Melanie reached up to the pantry shelf and pulled down a small wrapped box. Said it wasn't much, just something she found at a roadside antique store. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a frame. An old photo, me and Elma, young, unsure, still learning, but smiling the kind of smile that only comes from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. She said she thought the kitchen wall looked a little empty. I hung the photo above the pantry door. Just before bed, she asked if we could host a meal next week. Not a launch, not an event, just a gathering. A few neighbors, some family, quiet stories, real food. I nodded. It was the first time in a long while I'd said yes without holding anything back. That night, as I lay beneath the old quilt hand-stitched by Elma's mother during their first winter, I felt a calm settle deep inside me. Not because everything had been fixed, but because the bleeding had finally stopped. Some stories don't end with revenge or redemption arcs that sparkle. Some end quietly, with presence, with peace, with the kind of forgiveness that expects nothing in return except truth. And for me, that was enough. If this story touches something in you, some silence that lasted too long, or a kind of healing that took its time, know this. You are not alone. Sometimes the loudest pain is the kind we carry quietly. So if you're still waiting for someone to come home to you, whether in words or spirit, keep holding your truth. It matters. You matter. And healing, even in small steps, still counts. Thank you for listening.